Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's good to have you join us. I say good morning. Some of you may be from international, may not be morning where you are, but welcome. Thanks for joining us, and we're really looking forward to sharing with you on strategic resilience today. As you may have already picked up, I don't have a Kiwi accent. That's because I was born and raised in the United States. As a boy growing up in Michigan, we spent part of our summers at the family cottage on Lake Michigan. Now, just to give you a point of comparison, Lake Taupo, New Zealand's largest lake, is 616 square kilometers. That's a big lake if you've been there. Lake Michigan is 58,000 square kilometers. It's almost 100 times as big. You can actually surf on Lake Michigan. The shoreline along Lake Michigan has these massive sand dunes all along the way. And I remember as a boy watching a storm coming in, the thunder beginning to roll and the lightning flashing offshore and the waves building in power, and thinking to myself, time for me to get out of here. So I walked off the beach, over the dunes, down onto the other side. And when I got to the other side of the dunes, I felt safer. I was safer. And that's what resilience does for you. It makes you safer, able to survive the storms of life and thrive in the face of turbulence. So we're going to use sand dunes as a metaphor. You can see here a metaphor for organizational resilience. And here you can see a lovely community, nice, big, well-planted dunes. They can add real joy with the great view from the top of the dunes on a sunny day. They provide protection from the winds coming off the sea. Resilience is like the sand dunes. They can help us thrive in the day-to-day, and they can also provide protection from the storms that we end up facing. And of course, over the last 3 months or so, we've been facing a storm, the COVID-19 storm. It's ravaged our economic and social coastline. We can be grateful that the cost in human lives in New Zealand, at least, has been so low. Not so in so many other places, unfortunately. But we can only begin right now to see the effects on many of our businesses and on our broader economy. Your dunes may look a bit like this after the COVID-19 storm, badly eroded. Some of our organizations are teetering on the edge. We have managed the surviving bit. Now we need to rebuild those dunes and regain our thriving. So too with the things that contribute to our organization's resilience. Think about your financial reserves, your personal stamina, your emotional reserves, your relationships with your staff, with your supply chain, your customers, and so forth. They've gotten eroded by these storms. We know this from the Canterbury earthquakes, how that can work. For those of you who are local, our team lived through the Canterbury earthquakes, and we're experiencing it now again with COVID-19. Those dunes, your resilience reserves, do get eroded, and they need to be rebuilt. They need to be strengthened. It may be that you need even to pivot or reinvent your business and not rebuild in such a vulnerable spot. Teamwork and collaboration in designing our resilience will increase our future thriving and the protection afforded by those dunes from the future storms. Our dunes, they're made up of many small grains of sand, of course, each adding to the beauty of the dunes, the thriving they bring, and the protection that they afford to us. This presentation is all about effectively designing and rebuilding the dunes of our organizational resilience. Just a quick outline of what we'll cover, looking at your strategy, reviewing that, and thinking, how can I build an effective resilience strategy, and then reviewing the operational foundations, those things, those characteristics of your organization that allow you to implement your strategy effectively and to really make a difference. I'd also like to just comment on our partner in this, Ask Your Team, a New Zealand software company. They provided the software to support many of you who completed the survey, and we'll reflect on some of that data during our presentation today. So with that, I will pass it on to Tracy, and Tracy, fire away.
Awesome, thanks very much, John. So where we're going to start today is with looking at the strategy and the business model before we move on to those underlying characteristics that John's just mentioned enable the success of our strategy. So we're going to step you through our 6-stage process that you can see on screen at the moment, focusing on resilient strategy. We will provide, or the Chamber will provide a 2-page handout on this following the webinar as well, for you to be able to work through. So step 1 in this process is pretty straightforward. It's really just to sit down and remind yourself of what were your long-term or overall aims, and what was your plan of action designed to achieve them. So for the smaller of you, the sole operators out there, that might just be a few ideas in your head that you're going to continue to give great customer service to your existing customers, and that's your sort of business plan, and that's fine. For the larger amongst you, you might have a more comprehensive written strategic plan. Potentially that is a real labour of time and investment to create as well, and that can be problematic. So this presentation is relevant to that whole spectrum from small to large. Think about what your strategy is, and we're going to strongly suggest that there's a need to now review whether those goals and actions are now the right ones for business in our current changed environment. This process is all about being willing to pivot, change, or at the very least review whether your ideas are still sound. It was really interesting to look at the survey results here. We are ready to change strategic direction if necessary, and note that many of you are all over this. And of course, that's not unexpected from those who've endured the Canterbury earthquakes, where we saw a lot of necessary changes. We saw construction companies that became demolition companies for a few years, cafes that became caterers, retailers that changed their product lines to be more attractive to rebuild workers, motels that became homes for assessors and repairers rather than tourists. And some of the companies in that space may simply have been receptors of opportunities that arose, but for many of those businesses, they thought hard and they worked hard to adapt their offerings and their marketing to be successful in that environment. So lockdown forced some very rapid, but possibly some very temporary pivots. And for some businesses, reinvention might be a more appropriate word to use than pivot. On screen here is a couple of examples I've just picked up from the media. During level 4 lockdown, food wholesalers turning into direct-to-consumer businesses, whether that's a temporary or a long-term addition to their business model, only time will tell. That's looking at a new market segment, and our bottom example is probably a bit more reinvention than pivot, a backpacker dorm that's turning into escape rooms in time for the July school holidays. So some great thinking out there by businesses about what are the opportunities in our current environment and how do we reposition ourselves to take advantage of them. The process that we're talking about today, can we just go back one please? The 6-step process that we're going through today is about looking at the environment over the short, medium to long term. So sort of from now across the next 3 to 5 years. It might result in minor changes to your business, perhaps in what kind of customers you target or what kind of products or services you offer, or these more extreme examples of conversion to escape rooms, which is pretty cool. Okay, step 2 in our process, once you've got into your mind what were your goals and aims, is to take stock of the current situation. So potentially start looking internally at, firstly for your business, where are you at right now? What resources have you got? What does your forward cash flow look like? Do you have other lines of credit available? What assets do you have, both tangible and intangible? What connections and partnerships do you have that you may be able to leverage at this time? And what about your customer base? Don't forget that as an asset for your business. So just have a bit of a taking stock of where are you at internally, and then also looking externally at what's going on. What is happening with demand? Is it changeable? Is there anything we can do to change demand? Is there any one truth on what demand is likely to be? your supply chain. We're still looking internationally at some massive impacts from COVID. What impact might it have on your ability to continue to operate and supply? And of course, all of the existing trends that impacted businesses prior to COVID are still there and still need to be considered. I've put on the slide particularly technological changes and the impact they might be having. When you're looking at what the situation is and looking externally, it's really important to try and take in a variety of sources, for example, not just mainstream media on the state of the economy or the state of particular sectors of the economy, but reach out and talk to as many people as you can, be that competitors, neighbours, business associations, and try and figure out as many different and diverse perspectives on what the environment looks like. Again, really, really cool to see that many of you are all over this, 76% proactively evaluating how changing trends might impact your business. But a bit of some interesting looks there at sectors that are doing plenty and sectors that perhaps could or should be doing a little more in this space. So I'll hand you over to Charlotte to carry on with step 3 in our 6-step process.
Thanks very much, Tracy. So now you have a really good understanding of what is going on now and perhaps into the near future, the next couple of months. You need to start looking a little bit further ahead, so the next 1, 3, 5 years. And look, the reality is that none of us have a crystal ball. Back in December, we would not have foreseen a total country lockdown. We certainly didn't predict the Canterbury earthquakes, and global changes such as Brexit were also a surprise to many. So the reality is we just don't know what will happen. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop planning. What we can do is design a strategy that adapts to whatever the future holds. And part of this is about imagining a wide range of possible futures that we may experience. So in the survey we asked you to do before you joined this webinar, we asked this exact question: are people thinking about a range of future scenarios? And this was actually one of the lowest scoring questions that we asked. So it appears that this isn't routinely done. So with businesses and professional services, for example, saying they don't do this regularly, if at all. So we thought what we'd do is we'd take some time during this webinar to talk you through a potential approach to help you develop some future scenarios, which you can test your thinking against. And this is just to make sure that your strategy is really robust no matter what the future holds. Okay, so this approach, the first step is to identify the 2 biggest drivers, trends or uncertainties that might affect your business. This could be political, climatic, technological, social, geographical, customer trends, anything. So drivers will be different depending on what your business is. But in order for us to illustrate this approach for you today, we're going to take an example of one type of business. And we're going to say that we're a tourism company with a traditionally international market. So one big driver for this business might be the economy. So tourism relies really heavily on the availability of discretionary spending. So businesses in this tourism industry will be one of the first to be affected when the economy slows down. Another key driver which a tourism business that relies heavily on international travellers might see is that international travel habits might be a really key driver. So obviously now we've seen a lockdown due to the pandemic and we hope that these borders will open up soon. But other factors could also impact international travel, things such as climate change policies and perceptions, or perhaps geopolitical changes or stresses. So it is really something that should be considered in the longer term for these businesses. So as you can see on the screen there, we've set these 2 drivers up to form a kind of a 2x2 matrix. So this creates 4 scenarios which combine strong and weak economy and strong and weak international travel. And so you can use these to think about how your business could succeed across these different futures. And I'm going to talk through each of those 4 quadrants and what they might look like and how that might make the business that we're talking about think about their strategy. So in the top left-hand corner, we have a future which we're calling slow pace. So this is when international travel hasn't picked up, but actually there is a strong economy. So in this situation, a tourism business might look more heavily to invest and see how they can capture the more local demand. If we move over into the top right-hand corner, this scenario we're calling fast-paced. And this is really the ideal scenario for this particular business. The economy is strong and so is international travel. So the challenge really for them is to meet the high demand and perhaps even think about opportunities that they might go to expand or capture more of the market. The next scenario we're going to call hard yakka. So this is when the economy is not looking so good. But actually, for whatever reason, we do have a return of international travel. So there may be demand from the usual markets that this business attracts, but it might be not as high value, and not as many people. So the trick for this business might be thinking about how they maximise the value from the customers that they do get. And then we come to the last scenario, which we're calling acute care. And this is currently the reality for many tourism businesses in New Zealand, where there's a limited demand, both local and international, due to both economic and border conditions. So here tourism businesses need to get creative about how to diversify. You know, perhaps businesses could repurpose some of their skilled workers, chefs providing cooking classes for schools, for example, or perhaps Tracy's earlier example of a backpackers turned escape room. But perhaps doing this is just one way that enables them to move, but doing this, they need to do it in a way that enables them to move back into one of the other futures should the situation change unexpectedly. So look, the idea of these scenarios is really to see what your current strategy looks like in each of these 4 segments, and think about ways that you could easily pivot or change into each of those scenarios if situations change, like there was more international travel or better economic outcomes. And the idea is not to necessarily predict the future, but it's to identify how flexible we are and how able we are to move between those futures. So the next step in the process is step 4, and we've called that adaptive design. So that is matching the good situational awareness that we've developed and that Tracy talked about, and then also thinking about those longer term future outcomes of what we imagine could possibly happen, and develop a strategy that is really adaptable to change. So one of the ways to do this is to think of our strategy in terms of staged decisions. So often we create strategies as if they're linear. We choose a goal and we take steps directly towards that goal. But with so much uncertainty, we really need to break that journey up into a set of smaller decision points that allow us to change direction at any point if necessary. So alongside those staged decisions, we need alternative paths that we could take. And this is where your thinking around those future scenarios will really help. It'll help you think about the different paths that you may need to take if some of those key variables or key drivers for your business change. So continuing the tourism example, this could be investing more in domestic tourism, or changing your price point to attract different clients, or offering a different type of service. So to help this process, also identifying some really good trigger points might be useful. So by trigger points, I mean signals that might indicate you need to change direction. So in the tourism example, it could be opening of borders, economic conditions changing, or perhaps actions of competitors. The trigger points that you use will really depend on your business. Other strategies that you could use to become more adaptive is maximising your diversity. This includes diversity of your market, diversity of the suppliers that you have, the services you provide, or the staff you have. It's really easy in this post-pandemic world to think that we need to lock down and become totally local focused. And there's lots of benefits to that approach, but there's also a lot of risk to that. Particularly in New Zealand, where we're really vulnerable to natural disasters, as we all know. And in these times, international networks can become really helpful with customers and suppliers that are willing to support your business. So diversity is a key thing to factor into your strategic design. And the last point that we wanted to talk to around adaptive design is thinking about your decisions as equal parts least regret and opportunity. Like, business is about taking risk, and you should still do this, but it is really about balancing this risk and making sure that all your eggs aren't in one basket. So in the survey, we asked you about whether you're already taking steps to do this, to design a recovery strategy that is really adaptable to this changing environment. And this was done to a certain degree by many of you. I mean, not surprisingly, what we saw is the larger organisations had a bit more inertia, and they weren't didn't consider themselves as adaptable to change, whereas the smaller businesses scored a little bit higher. So the fifth step in this process is around having a critical review of the strategy that you've designed. So it's a really good idea to test your thinking with other people who are outside your organisation, in particular people or organisations you work with. This is to make sure your thinking is aligned with them, but also to test your own logic. So it's easy, it's also even better if you and your key partners are on the same path and you're preparing to adapt to move in the same way during a disruption. It may sound like a cliche, but you really are stronger together. And the last step is really to rinse and repeat. This is not a one-off static process. It's something that we need to keep revisiting. And some of those ideas that we shared around setting trigger points and having those decision points will naturally tend you towards doing this. But it's just remember to not put it on the shelf, but to keep it at the forefront and keep making sure you're heading in the right direction and that you're still aligning yourself with your purpose and values. So I'm going to hand back to Tracy now, who's going to talk about the enabling environment, what the organisation needs to look like to enable us to really take advantage of our adaptive resilience strategies.
Thanks, Charlotte. So we asked in the survey how many organisations out there were actively looking for opportunities to improve performance. And this question was the highest score of those pre-survey questions. So fantastic to see that so many of you are looking at ways to improve performance. The perspective we bring today may be a little different from some of the typical efforts. So I hope there is value here in this material, even to those of you who are obviously doing a lot in that space. So the three areas that I'm going to briefly talk through underpin your ability to decide and implement the resilience strategy, as well as provide the opportunity for others to contribute good ideas to your strategy. So going back to our sand dune analogy, think of these things as the foundations of your sand dune. Maybe there's a bit of concrete in the very bottom, or maybe these just other wee grains of sand that are piling onto the top. So when we think about improving organisations' performance, a resilience perspective brings the idea that this should be about harnessing the power of your team. For those of you who have one, sorry, not so much for those who don't, obviously. For those who don't, it's a little bit more about harnessing the power of yourself to step back from the day-to-day of your business and spend some time working on rather than in your business. So these resilient underpinnings start with leadership. Building back resilience requires leadership that empowers and engages rather than directs. Because empowered and engaged staff put in extra effort. They bring their initiative, they're proactive, they're adaptive, they're a really powerful force for the good of your organisation. Resilient organisations try and devolve decision-making where possible, recognising that there's a really significant interplay between decision-making, empowerment and engagement. An organisation with great culture and leadership continues those efforts on situation awareness. It doesn't do it alone. It harnesses the power of the team to do that. Great if you can have all of your team keeping their ears to the ground and feeding through information, because often it's those frontline workers that are hearing things first, and they need to know that that's information that you want shared. And finally, on leadership and culture, encouraging and celebrating innovation and allowing for experimentation and potential failure. That's hard in this current environment where there is a temptation to sort of lock the drawbridges down, really preserve every penny that you can. But opportunity is opened up through a little bit of experimentation and allowing for some ideas and some initiatives that don't prove to be profitable. So it's important to ensure that when you are thinking of improving organisational performance, that you consider the broad impact of organisational leadership at all levels in your organisation, from team leader to mid-manager to the senior exec, and the impact of organisational culture. Because an engaged, empowered team who innovate can do amazing things even in a recessionary environment. The second pillar in our underpinnings of the sand dune is all about networks and relationships. So your organisation is part of a complex, interconnected ecosystem of businesses, and how you work that system can give you significant strategic advantages. Networks can do a lot of things for you. They feed you useful information and also help you make sense of that information. They can sell for you. They can provide surge capacity for you. So in Charlotte's example of the tourism business that needs to be tiny and small right now, but ready to be able to grow, that surge capacity can be a really, really important strategic advantage over your competitors. Networks and relationships can also negatively impact your organisation as well. I'm sure you're all familiar with how quickly bad news can spread through social media. So now is a good time to take stock. Who do you have relationships with? What might you do to deepen those? Or who should you be going out and building new ones with? The good news for those of you who are coffee lovers like me is really my takeaway message here is reach out, go out and have more coffees with people. We see here the survey results on this topic of working closely with organisations. I think it shows that there's some room to grow in this area. Okay, the third part of our underpinnings of our sand dune is about being change ready. So we're all feeling pretty change fatigued at this moment. So what we're seeing here is, the end of a race collapsed on the ground. And I know a lot of people are feeling a wee bit like that at the moment. But we need to move as quickly as we can from recovering from this amazing pace of change over the last 3 months to rebuilding our ability to be poised and ready to embrace further change. We need to get back into the starting blocks again. So our resilience strategy suggestions are part of the planning for this, but we need leadership to create the vision and the energy for it as well. So like the sprinter in the blocks, we need to be staying on our toes, be ready to move as the environment changes, be thinking several steps ahead and looking for the next move. The survey results showed that businesses are actively looking for opportunities and see change as an opportunity. That's fantastic. Clearly a little bit of room in the large organisations to try and move towards that culture. Over to John.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy. As a young boy, I found the storms coming off of Lake Michigan fearsome. Yes, they scared me. Many of you may feel that way in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic and what's going on, both within New Zealand and globally. I know I have had my moments. Yes, your resilience has probably been eroded by the unprecedented storm, our favorite word for this event. But then the Canterbury earthquakes were a once in 2,500-year event. It too was unprecedented, but we did survive. The dunes of your resilience have hopefully done their job of protecting you in the COVID-19 storm. You have survived. We hope that so far this morning, we've added to your resilience building toolkit some key elements to designing those resilience dunes. They've included things like looking at your strategic direction, your situation awareness, stress testing that strategy with multiple scenarios and thinking how your current strategy will fit in different kinds of futures. Then looking at the underlying organizational characteristics that enable the success of your strategy, your leadership and culture, your networks and relationships, and being change ready as an organization. So I say, here's to the dune builders. Here's to the dune planters. We will rebuild our resilience. We will thrive again. Thank you very much. And we're open for questions.
That was a really great visual way. Thank you, Charlotte. I think I was on mute there, apologies. Thank you, Charlotte, Tracy and John. I really liked your metaphor, John, on sand dunes for describing organisational resilience. It was a great visual way for me to understand the external impacts on our business like COVID. You also raised some really interesting points to consider and some really good key reminders. A few takeaway messages for me. We never stop planning just because we don't know what the future holds, and designing a strategy that has the ability to adapt. And I think, Tracy, your point there of connectedness and having some coffee, and I think someone else in the chat also agrees with that point as well. So excellent. So we now move to the Q&A part of the session, and we've got a couple of questions, but I would remind participants, if you want to ask some questions, do pop those in the question panel at the bottom of your screen there, and we will be able to answer those. So let me just see what we've got. There's some questions. So Megan asks, how effective is this model applied in normal strategic planning as opposed to just after a storm?
I might kick off with an answer and then see what my colleagues think about what I said. I think the starting point is to recognize that we're in the midst of a particular storm. We're not even at the end of it yet. And so we're in the midst of a lot of change. But if you rewind back to, say, pre-Christmas, the world is not standing still. The world seems, at least to me, far more turbulent today than, say, a decade or two ago. And so I think the model that we were talking about is applicable in almost any circumstance. Now, there will be some industries and some locations where things are very static, so it might not work so well there. But I think most places are facing a fair amount of turbulence from geopolitical changes, from economic changes, from technological changes, all happening at the same time. We're living in an increasingly high change world. And therefore, I think applying these things in a more business as usual setting is actually a brilliant thing to do. Because I think the reality for us as human beings is we only get good at the things that we practice. And so practicing in a business as usual setting will hone your skills, your thinking, so you don't have to dredge up, now, what did they say in that seminar, in that webinar? But rather it's front of mind because you're using it frequently. That would be my view. I'm not sure what Charlotte and Tracy think. But.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think if there's a silver lining of the pandemic is that it's brought this uncertainty and this instability and complexity to the world to the fore, and so we're suddenly realising that actually we're not as in control. I mean, in Canterbury we're potentially a step ahead in some other regions because we've faced the earthquakes and we've got used to adapting. But I think now everyone is sort of realising that actually we need to do this. We need to be ready for change.
Well said, Tim.
That's great. We have one question that actually got put through in the chat, and the question was, does resilience planning change by sector?
The fundamentals of the process we've outlined don't, but the key levers in that 2x2 quadrant will change by sector. So we picked ones that were particularly relevant for tourism. You need to pick those particular drivers that drive your sector. But the process of working through and trying to create sort of 4 plausible futures for your organisation stay the same. It's just what the levers you pull are.
Yeah, so I think when I was speaking, I was saying, your drivers might be politically led. If somehow your business is highly influenced by regulation changes, or perhaps you might be really affected by climate change or technological changes. The electricity sector, for example, technology change would be one of the key disruptors for that industry. So yes.
Yeah, dropping down a level, foot traffic. So for some of the smaller guys out there, one of those key levers in that model might be foot traffic, and the other one to do with economic and discretionary spend. Yeah.
I think a good question to think about too is the issue of, well, how do you come up with these? And I think if you're a business that has employees, get them together and brainstorm all of the possible levers everybody can think about. Then you can filter that and think, okay, well, which of these are the top 2? And whittle down that list until you've got the 2 you think are the most potent and give you a good offset between the 2. I think that would be a good approach. If you're a very small business, sole trader, you could get together with some of your competitors who you don't compete directly with, but maybe indirectly, or family members or friends to get together. You can do it by yourself, But the reality is I think it's going to be harder to come up with an effective list and narrow it down fruitfully if you have to do it all by yourself. And it's more fun to do things together with friends, family, colleagues, people in your supply chain. So pick some people you trust and have a go at it.
That's great, John. I think that's really important about that connectedness. A question here. I would like to know more about the scenario modelling you spoke about.
Yeah, I guess I'm perhaps interested to know exactly what else you want to know about that. I guess we've sort of talked about the way that you can choose those different, identify the drivers and choose different ones. We have spoken just about a 4-quadrant model, but if you really think that you've got three key drivers, well, you can make that a 3x3 matrix as well. But the key idea is to get as diverse scenarios as possible, so that you're really spanning the full range of what actions you want to do. And it's not about predicting the future. It definitely is not. It's about dictating what potential different directions you might need to go in, and that making sure that when you're thinking about your strategy, that you're thinking it in a way that allows you to adapt. You're choosing your least regret option. You're not choosing one direction and forsaking all of the other directions that you may need to go in.
And I'll just add to that the fundamental shift there is to even just realise that we can't predict what the future is. So, you know, when we think about most sort of strategic planning processes, implied in people's minds is a particular straight line view of what the future is going to be. So it's the creation, so it's the thinking process that opens out that into sort of more of a funnel of future possibility. That's the power, not so much fretting about the detail that goes into any of the specific futures you come up with.
Yeah.
I think to pick up on a couple of things that Charlotte mentioned also would be to the process of taking your existing strategy where you thought you were going and then comparing it to each of the 4 quadrants and thinking, maybe let's say there's five key elements to your current strategy, and going through each of those elements and saying, how well will that work in quadrant A, B, C, D, and maybe even scoring it if you're that sort of person who likes to go through and do some analysis and think that particular bullet from my 5 key bullets is only going to rate as a 1 in quadrant A, but in quadrant C it actually works pretty well. And go through each of those key elements, because that'll give you a sense of which of the elements of your current strategy are going to work well, regardless of which quadrant you end up in this unknown future as it unfolds. And then try and come up with, again, with your team, other parts to a strategy that might fit better in some quadrants than others, and they can just sit on the side and you can plug them in. They're part of that decision-making and flexibility of how you move when things start to clarify, because they might clarify for 3 or 4 months and then change again, especially in the kind of setting that we're in right now, which is all over the place.
Yeah, and then one of the things you can also do is, we've talked about looking at your existing strategy and how that fits into these futures. You can actually do the same with a new strategy. So you can still start with those futures and think, what are the skills, what are the resources, what are the market segments that work best across all those different future scenarios. So you can do top-down or bottom-up approach as well.
That's great, thank you. Should this resilience strategy be part of an organisation's BCP, business continuity planning plan?
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to flip that around and suggest that it's a BCP that's part of an overall resilience strategy.
Just to make sure everyone knows what BCP is. So BCP is a business continuity plan, so it enables you to deal with disruptions.
Yeah, but it tends to deal with the physical, the resource impacts of disruptions, finding new premises or getting your IT systems back up and running, prioritising what are the key areas of business you need to get up and going. So, a lot of organisations will have been looking at their BCP plans during level 4 lockdown in order to prioritise what activities and actions needed to go on and what was needed to make that happen. What we also saw through level 4 lockdown, of course, though, is an awful lot of adaptation. And that's why we regard a business continuity plan as only one part of an overall resilience strategy, because how you build that, that ability to adapt is where we come back to our culture and leadership, our networks and relationships, and our change readiness. The other place where I can see a connection between the resilience strategy and a business continuity plan is ideally a business continuity plan may point you at what you should be doing as part of recovery. So it'd be useful if a business continuity plan was sort of laying out for you that the next steps for you when we stop using the BCP are to move to review and think about strategy.
Yeah, and what we've seen in the pandemic scenario is that many of the workarounds that have been used for business continuity purposes are actually potentially going to become embedded within organisations as a long-term change. And so there is an opportunity in crisis that you can fast-track some of those longer-term decisions that you're wanting to make. So I think in that way it is good to have them talking to each other. So you do this future thinking and you say, well, we might need to pivot in that direction or that direction. And then a crisis hits and it means that's just going to happen a bit faster. So you're much more ready to change direction because you've thought about what that might look like and what resources and how that might play out.
This also, I think, folds back to one of the earlier questions about does this mechanism of resilience planning and looking at different futures only work in a big crisis? Can you use it more or less in a business as usual setting? And my response, of course, was, well, we're in a high change world. It's useful all the time. And so I think tying it together with our BCP plan, very useful. Also, I would say the same thing is true to a considerable extent if you have an emergency plan, which is a bit different than a BCP plan, your risk planning. I think those are all part of the planning process. And probably the biggest difference is that we view resilience planning as something that you can use in a business as usual setting as well as in a crisis setting, because effective resilience pays day-to-day dividends, just like that doom does. There's day-to-day benefits without any storm. You know, there's the joy of the view, there's the protection from the wind, there's all kinds of benefits from those dunes besides protecting you from the big storm. And so the pieces fit together, and we think taking that bigger picture view that resilience planning gives you, it helps tie all those important pieces of planning together.
That's great. Thank you, John and team. So just looking now at the people focus of your employees. So at what step do you consider your employees' resilience in order to build a resilient strategy? And what impact does employees' low resilience have on your strategy if you do not address this?
I think that's a really good question. If you don't mind my chipping in, we've run a number of projects with New Zealand organizations, critical infrastructure organizations, and one of the things that we've found is that your employees are critical, and if you've got employees that are not resilient, that can undermine what you're doing. But you need to realize that their resilience isn't just something about them personally, because there's three kinds of resilience that fit into this that are related to the individuals. There's personal resilience, and that's what's life like at home. Do you eat well? Are you getting enough rest? Are you getting exercise? Those things which are important for personal resilience, and that's beneficial to the organization, but it's not the same thing as employee resilience, which is quite dependent on the culture of the organization itself. And so the employee resilience brings their personal resilience to the table, but then you have to look, how does the organization function? There's a lot of bullying going on within your organization. You can have an individual who's very resilient personally, but in the work setting, they're not. Their resilience is undermined because of the bullying culture or very top-down decision-making process, or the senior leaders not wanting to hear bad news. You know, the whole range of cultural aspects that impact on the resilience of the individual employees and corporately as employees that impact on the organization's resilience overall. They're all intertwined with one another, and you can unpick them to some extent, but the reality is they're all linked together, just like a piece of rope. You know, you cut one strand of the three-strand rope, and the whole thing starts to unravel.
What we see all too often is a focus on solely on introducing wellbeing programs and focusing on the personal resilience, and that's really useful and really important. But it's not a SOP for reducing workloads or improving the culture within an organisation, and we would always suggest that both. That's a two-pronged approach to meet in the middle to improve resilience.
And not just culture, but also process. Sometimes, especially large organizations, they may have 10 different processes in different parts of the organization for the same thing, which means you can't actually transfer staff from Department A to Department B and help them carry that process out because they're different. So you have these inefficiencies that annoy people, makes it difficult to improve the quality of what's being done. So there's all of these different elements. They vary, of course, depending on the organization size.
That's great, thank you. So what practical interventions enhance resilience? Planning is an intervention in itself, clearly would. So any other suggestions, please?
Many. I mean, we've just talked about people and how important people are. So, I mean, and that's something we always talk about as a really easy step to get people engaged, is to have social events, to kind of try and create a bit more atmosphere and family and connectedness within your organisation, because that'll help build trust and it'll help build how well people relate to each other and support each other through. I think another one that jumps to mind as well is about how you make decisions day to day in your organisation. Is it someone sitting behind a desk making all the decisions for the whole organisation, or is it about you actively seeking out input from staff and particularly looking for diversity when you're making decisions as well, making sure you get diverse views that could be different age groups, different skill sets, different backgrounds, just to make sure that you're making decisions that are inclusive of everyone, but are as robust as possible, because those diverse viewpoints are really a way to stress test the decisions that you're making.
I think to pick up on a point that Charlotte made too, with regard to trust. A colleague of ours in Australia carried out a study a few years back with regard to what CEOs thought created organizational resilience. And one of the key takeaways from his study, from Robert Kay's study, was that the heart of organizational resilience is the culture of the organization. Mm-hmm. And the key element, the linchpin in that culture, was trust. And so how do we go about building trust within the organization? And there's a whole range of elements that are part of that. And Charlotte touched on one of them, decision-making. If all the decisions are made at the top, what that communicates to your staff is the top people don't trust the people further down to make decisions. So that undermines trust. And there's a whole range of things that can be done to build trust, or that can undermine trust. That's one particular one. Another one is the silos within the organization. If they're very hard silos and people don't talk to one another, that means they haven't got the capacity for building up trust between those different parts of the organization. So having cross-functional teams solve problems together means, number one, you get a better solution, a better decision, but it also means you build trust between the people in the organization. And that good decision that solves a problem in silo A can then also be picked up and possibly used in other silos. So you have these trust building processes that can be put in place that can go a long way to building the resilience of the organization, faster, higher quality decisions, people buying in and working together to solve the problems of the organization, people rejoicing together over the good things that happen together. All of those are trust building tasks or processes, you might say.
That's great. And just following on from that, culture and trust is a question here. This session all seems to hinge on leadership and effective organisational design and processes. Do you have a view on where ownership of resilient best sits in an organisation to make it part of the culture and get done?
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Tracy,
it sits with the entire organisation, but clearly it does need some level of buy-in and leadership from the top. But having said that it does need to come from the top, the middle level can stop it dead in its tracks. So some great work out of University of Canterbury post-earthquake that showed the important role of those middle managers in setting the tone. So it has to sit at many levels. It's a bit of a way of thinking, a resilient way of thinking that needs to infect, as many people as possible and become a way of being.
I think a key issue also is the nature of the leadership and how long-standing they are. One of the problems that many, especially medium-sized and larger organizations, face is churn at the top. So they have a CEO come in and they're there for 2 or 3 or 4 years and they move on, having implemented new strategies and new ways of doing things that haven't penetrated deeply into the organization. And it's really in those sort of settings where that culture of resilience could be embedded in the middle managers, maybe more stable with the organization. And looking out for that problem of senior management churn, I think, is a very serious problem because our senior managers often don't stay put for very long. And building a strategy to overcome that and have resilience sit with the organization as a whole, have that clearly known to be the case with the board also. So I think there are some things we can do specifically to deal with real everyday issues that organizations, larger ones in particular, I'm referring to.
What we'd really like to see is like how health and safety culture has kind of penetrated organisations, and now there's always a health and safety lens over everything you do. Wouldn't it be great if there was a resilience lens across everything you do? So you had resilience champions who sat across the organisation, and through any decision, any kind of project work, there's someone at the table who just has that clear lens in their mind that they can look over things. Is this going to be an adaptable solution? Are we being inclusive? Are we including diverse ideas? So just the same, it's the culture and ethos within that organisation that penetrates everything.
Absolutely.
That's great. Yes, that's certainly something that would be a great opportunity for businesses, definitely. So last question here, as a key lever driver, would staff and community engagement be re-leveled for an education provider or school?
Relevant,
I think it means, yeah. Yes. I think the key drivers tend to be external drivers. So things that the organisation is having to deal with. So when you're talking about having staff and community engagement as a driver, that is potentially more of an outcome than a driver, I think.
We're assuming this question relates to what are the levers or drivers for the scenario, for creating scenarios.
That's what I'm assuming, yeah.
Okay.
But apart from that, I think just in a business as usual setting, and even in a crisis, the staff and community engagement for public sector organizations in general and schools in particular and university are really important drivers. If your staff are not on board with your strategy, you're simply not going to be able to build the momentum that you need behind your strategy. And a certain way to improve staff and the community getting behind your strategy is to directly involve them in building strategy. People are always more likely to get behind something they've been involved in rather than something they've been sidelined in. So really that comes back to the whole process of collaboration, which is a critical process within building resilience into an organization. So I think those are very important features. How you use them, whether they're in a business as usual setting or in the midst of a crisis, I think they're very fruitful and important features.
That's great. Well, looking at the time, I think we will end, given that the questions have come to an end. I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's session. And thank you very much again, Charlotte, Tracy and John, for your time and valuable insights today. I certainly think that people would have got a lot of great information today. I would like to acknowledge our principal sponsor, Westpac, and major sponsors, Enable and Orion, for their ongoing support of the Chamber. Coming out next in our online support series, we will have an update for exporters and manufacturers on the government capability and funding support available, taking place on Wednesday, the 24th of June. And to support you with your next steps following this particular webinar, we have a new powerful strategy webinar series starting on the 22nd of July. The series of 3 webinars is designed to support business owners and leaders in clearly defining the real problems that need to be solved within your business before you start jumping to solutions. The practical tools and techniques conveyed in the sessions will support attendees to develop strong, logical, defensible strategies and ultimately better outcomes for their business. We will include more detail on this and other useful training and event information in today's follow-up. Stay strong, kia kaha.